Hey there folks, this is Dan Inferred from Caliber Magazine, and today we're going to be discussing the news that broke just this morning. The Canada Post is refusing to take part in the confiscation of firearms triggered by the May 1st, 2020 order in council that banned some 1,500 different kinds of long gun, predominantly center-fire semi-automatic magazine-fed guns like the AR-15, the VZ-58, the Swiss Arms Ruger Mini-14, the Norinco M14, all that sort of thing. That program that was announced in 2020 has been a work in progress ever since, with the government contracting IBM to come up with some sort of plan by which they could kind of action the prohibition on those guns and confiscate them from owners. The inevitable or the end result of that, because of Canada's geographic landmass and the volume of guns being involved, was that gun owners would log on to an online portal, effectively put forward an application to have their guns confiscated, receive some sort of compensation offer of some sort, and once they accepted that offer, get a box from Canada Post into which they would put the gun, ship it off to the firearms program, who would then evaluate it, provide a more clear idea of value, confirm the compensation offer or amend it. You'd go through a dispute process if you didn't like that, and then the gun would be destroyed. Notably, if you disputed the value, you were never getting your gun back, so you didn't really have much option to really dispute that in any kind of real way, but that's a separate matter entirely. The news that came out today, Canada Post wrote a letter to someone in the government, apparently, saying that they were not going to participate or cooperate or take part in this program, and they cited reasons of employee safety. Specifically, the articles that have been coming out so far only cite one example of Canada Post concerns around public safety, and it is specific to a potential of conflict between the employees at Canada Post who would be collecting these boxes and distributing them, I guess, in the first place, and those that would be putting guns in them, i.e. gun owners and postal workers. Now from this, I mention this because it's important to note this is not a Canada Post statement. It's a letter that was intended to apparently be private between Canada Post and the government, and this leak is from someone in the government, and the leak is only this one example. Now, the news cites that this is one example, which means Canada Post provided more than one example of where they would be concerned about employee safety in regards to all of this. And I would bring up that the one example provided is actually it's obviously one of the first ones that people think of, but it's one of the least likely scenarios for conflict to actually arise, because right now, and likely in perpetuity running forward, the people that own these guns, that have possession of these newly prohibited firearms, that the government calls them, are covered by an amnesty, meaning that those that have them can't be criminally charged with possession of a prohibited firearm. And that amnesty is likely going to continue in perpetuity based on a bunch of legal reasons, not the least of which is the precedent set by the Long Gun Registry, which had the same sort of effect. So everyone that would be participating in it and giving their guns to a postal worker will be largely doing so on a voluntary basis, because as long as the amnesty is in place, compliance is effectively optional. So whether or not there would be a lot of conflict between gun owners giving their guns to the government in exchange for money and the postal workers who would be tasked with carrying these guns is something that's up for debate. But I think more importantly, like I said, that is just one example that Canada Post provided in this letter. And while they don't address the other safety concerns Canada Post had, I think we can probably infer a couple, the most obvious of which is obviously theft in transit, robbery, that sort of thing. These boxes would have to be a standardized item because of the economies of scale. We're talking between, like I said, 144,000, 500,000 guns, depending on whose estimates you believe. That's a huge volume. They can't be producing boxes for every individual model. They would have to have one standardized unit. That makes them very identifiable, and that makes them very susceptible to theft. Both at the end where you're dropping them off, everywhere along the logistical route, every Canada Post outlet that these boxes would then be in. To be honest, every Canada Post outlet would be considered as probably likely having some of these things in them. So every Canada Post outlet would be a likely target for criminals to break into and steal these guns. Canada Post outlets are generally quite secure, but they, suffice to say, do not match the security standards of, say, gun stores, where CFOs require things like bollards, locks, monitored alarms, things like that. Most Canada Post outlets in rural areas are counters at the back of a pharmacy that half the time are unstaffed. I'm fairly certain you could probably just walk into the back room on a bunch of those and no one would even notice if you're there. So there's tons of concerns, both for the security of the general public with regards to standardized mailing of guns, but also for the safety of the employees at Canada Post. because if someone's breaking into a post office to steal a bunch of guns, it can be assumed that they probably don't want to do nice things with those guns, and they may not they may be willing to do not nice things to get those guns in the first place. That's the second most obvious, and in my mind, the most obvious concern for the employees of Canada Post and their safety is that. The third is one that's sort of more internal to Canada Post. If you ever ship a gun with Canada Post, they have internal policies. The gun must be shipped by ground, it must be securely locked, and it can't have any ammo in it. It also can't be in an identifiable box that is clearly marked as a gun or anything like that. It's one of the policies they've got. So that in and of itself sort of seems to run counter to this program that the government would like to run. But again, it's kind of a third, not really a safety concern, more of a policy thing. But anything that goes through their postal system, most stuff is x-rayed. If it's in a box that looks kind of gun-shaped, it's definitely getting x-rayed. If it's in a box that's standardized for the carriage of guns, it's definitely getting x-rayed. And as we all know, just as likely, I would say not likely, as certain as it would be that someone would try and rob a Canada Post van or store to try and get their hands on some of these guns illegally, there would absolutely be cases of gun owners simply not complying with the instructions when it comes to boxing their gun up, forgetting to put a trigger lock on it. Someone would forget to unload the thing. You just know that's going to happen. And when that goes through the x-ray machine, everything that isn't compliant with Canada Post shipping regulations goes to a singular facility in Ontario where people are licensed, the staff there are licensed to handle firearms. In most cases, they will take the gun out of the box, they'll put a trigger lock on it, they'll put it in a locked case, and they'll continue sending it on its way. But it causes a massive delay. And again, when you're talking the scale of guns we're talking about, 144,000 guns at the government's estimate, which is comically low, given there's 110,000 AR-15s on the registry, to over 500,000 guns in the industry side, which in my opinion is still low. You can easily see a world in which this one facility gets overwhelmed, and when the systems get overwhelmed, they start to break down, and with that comes security risks, obviously. So there's three massive reasons right there as to why I think Canada Post is probably pretty smart to have authored this letter. Now, the last thing I'll mention is specifically with regards to the leak. I know a lot of people are very happy with the leak. Who doesn't love a good government leak, right? Everyone loves to see that little bit of inside scoop. But there are some concerns around this one specifically and I wonder about the motive. Because like I said, I think that theft in transit and the theft from Canada Post outlets is a larger concern for most people with regards to the safety for the general public and Canada Post employees as this plan moves forward. But the fact that they cited conflict between gun owners and Canada Post employees is quite both weird and specific. I say weird because, like I said, if everyone's participating in this program voluntarily, it's hard to imagine there would be a tremendous amount of conflict. Even if you're in a state of financial duress where you're like, hey, I've got to sell this gun back because I got to make my mortgage payment, there'd be a little bit of relief, you would think, in the notion they're giving you this option. I obviously detest the notion of it at the very core, but for the individual, putting myself in that perspective, I could see there being a little bit of relief potentially. You might not like the dollar figure, but again, you're choosing to do this voluntarily. They've given you multiple steps along the way to say like, no, I don't like that compensation figure. Don't ship me the box or something. Who knows how that would work? But you could also just choose to not do it at all because of the amnesty, like I said. So it's hard to imagine that being the core risk, I suppose, but it is the one that paints gun owners in the most negative light. This notion that gun owners are going to be some sort of Wild West vigilante that starts shooting at postal workers trying to get their guns. That's not a thing that gun owners should want out there and be thinking this is a good idea. It's not the reality, I don't think, like I've said. But it is one that's kind of concerning with regards to if this is what your concern is and this is what you're going to make the public concerned about, what is the response going to be to that? How are you actually going to get these? Because this obviously, and the last thing I'll say is, obviously throws a huge monkey wrench into the whole works. In New Zealand, which is the ban that our government tried to copy, they had 10,000 AR-15s on an island that was tiny. They had most gun owners simply drive to urban centers and submit the guns in person where they collected them, and all of this was handled face-to-face sort of situation. It wasn't by mail. Canada obviously is huge. Our geographic area is one of the largest land masses in the world, and we have no shortage of these guns. We are not like New Zealand. We are an incredibly heavily armed country if you accept everyone else except the United States, because they set such a high bar in terms of that particular metric. But there are a lot of these guns out there, and they are spread across a massive country. If you can't ship them by Canada Post, and to be honest, FedEx, Purelator, which is part of Canada Post, UPS, any carriage would have the same concerns about this. So if Canada Post won't do it and they're a crown corporation, it's unlikely you're going to get a private sector person to do this sort of thing. So if you can't get a shipping company to do this, who is going to? The only sort of thing you kind of get your head around with regards to that publicly leaked reason would be like a Garda or a Brinks truck. But I mean, there's tons of problems with having armored cars roll up to every gun owner's house as well, not the least of which is the security of the people in the house. Armored cars rolling up to people's houses, not a really friendly sight. It's not great for your neighbors, not great for your reputation. It would also cost a metric ton, which this whole program is obviously already doing so, which both justifies it costing even more down the road because, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound. But also, there's some logic behind the notion that the more they spend on this, the less they can afford to spend with things like armored car service for some 500,000 guns potentially. It's just outlandish. So I think that's the sort of the three things, the three sort of supposed risks that I thought Canada Post might also include in this letter. I suspect there is quite a litany of them that we're not even aware of because there's a lot of things that go on at Canada Post that most of us don't know about, myself included. I'm sure there are policy concerns, like I said, about how these guns are shipped specifically, how the box would be set up, identifiableness of it, just a metric ton of issues. So I think Canada Post is in the right to write the letter. I think gun owners are right to see a little bit of hope in this with regards to potential problems for the government with completing this confiscation. But like I said, I've got some concerns about how this leak actually occurred and the motives behind it because it does seem oddly specific. So if you like this stuff, at the end of every video, like every other YouTuber does, I'll say like, comment, subscribe. I will be in the comments section replying as much as possible for as long as possible. When I say subscribe, I mean obviously to our YouTube channel because we're doing more of these. I've got a couple videos in the pipeline and our first, I think, video gun review actually coming up soon. So subscribe to the channel if you guys like this content. If you want to support what we are doing here in a real fiscal way, as in like, you know, me doing this 8 hours a day, reporting on this stuff, following the gun news and keeping people abreast of the politics when I see it's fit, like this sort of situation, subscribe to our actual magazine. There will be a link in the description below. We will send you 6 copies of a print magazine. We've been doing it for 12 years now, full of gun reviews and gun politics coverage like this. We go into much more depth because it's obviously a print product. We have a lot of words. We can quote people directly, and we're not limited by me trying to keep these YouTube videos relatively short. So that said, I will thank you all for your time. I hope this video finds you well as I try and remember to say at the end of all of them, look after your own mental health, look after yourselves, get outside, spend some time, touch grass, as they say on the internet. And once you've done that, subscribe, comment, like, all that other stuff. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks so much.